Welcome to Full Focus. I'm Gloria Penner. Will we or won't we be voting on October 7th on whether Gray Davis should remain California's governor? Everything is uncertain now that a court decision to postpone the recall election is up for appeal. Meanwhile, the voters, the candidates, and the people charged with managing the voting process are trying to understand California's political puzzle. Who's celebrating, who's worried, and who's reorganizing? With me to discuss the implications of the latest developments are Carl Luna, political science professor at Mesa College, and Tad Kousser, an election scholar who teaches political science at UC San Diego. Gentlemen, welcome. I'm delighted that you're with us. And let me ask that question of you. Who's celebrating, who's worried, and who's reorganizing, Carl?
Well, until the Supreme Court or the Ninth Circuit is finished up with this matter, I don't think anybody's taking the champagne out of the bottle yet. But I think the Davis camp has the most to be happy about right now.
But because?
Well, anything that postpones this, the theory is the longer it takes to bring this to the ballot, to a vote, the better it's going to do for the Davis camp. If it goes to March, all the conventional wisdom is that Davis has a much better chance of beating this than he did last week or this week or maybe even next week.
Why is that? Thad, I don't understand that. Why would Davis have a much better chance?
Well, I think the conventional wisdom is that a recall election held in March will be held at the same time that a presidential primary is taking place, where all sorts of Democratic candidates, including now General Wesley Clark, will bring out excited Democratic base voters. But I think there's some problems with the conventional wisdom. You have to weigh that against what Gray Davis has to do between now and March. Let me give you a couple dates. October 12th is when Gray Davis needs to make a decision on many of the controversial bills that passed the legislature, and that date doesn't fall before the October 7th recall. So he was going to be able to wait until after the recall to make a decision on things like the health care mandate bill SB 2, but now he's going to have to make these tough decisions before the recall.
So you're saying that some unpopular decisions might work against him between now and March 2nd if the recall election takes place then. But there's something else that I wanted to bring up, and that is that KPBS did a poll along with Competitive Edge Research just last week, and it showed that there was going to be a big turnout on October 7th. Now, might we see that we are going to have some apathy develop among voters, and that the whole idea that in March all these Democrats are going to turn out and they're going to vote for Governor Davis may not be the truth?
Sure, they may not be excited about the recall defending Governor Davis after he's made some tough decisions, or they might not be excited about their presidential candidates. So there's definitely a possibility that recall in March will be just as low as, that turnout in March will be just as low as turnout in most primary elections.
What do you think the chances are, Carl, that maybe March won't be that grand dessert buffet that Governor Davis's forces were hoping for?
Well, there is that risk, especially when they have to reconsider elements in the budget deal, which are going to come back on the table sometime for the new budget coming up. And but I think when you weigh it all out, again, recalls, that what motivated this was anger and emotion. And again, I think it's going to be hard for that level of anger that the public felt at Davis all through the spring and into the summer to keep itself going into March. I mean, you're not looking at a $38 billion budget shortfall. They got to deal with substantially less, and I don't think he's going to alienate as many people as he did last year.
So it's hard to sustain anger, and anger could turn into apathy, and people might just become less interested in March. Is that
would be my bet. I think the turnout's going to be lower in March than it otherwise would have been if they'd done it in October.
What about the issue that Thad brought up about the presidential primary? I mean, might not the presidential primary, even the Democratic presidential primary, overshadow this whole thing, and people would say, well, you know, I'll come out and I'll vote for a candidate for president in the Democratic column, but I'm not really interested in voting for the recall.
If we were in New Hampshire, that'd be the case. If we were a southern state, that would be the case. But the California primary hasn't historically been the critical mass, and even with the early March primary we're having, it's very likely that momentum and all building, by the time it rolls into California, the Democrats are going to have a much better idea who their candidate's going to be. So I don't think it's going to be pulling the voters out nearly as much. Historically, it's been over by California.
Really? There are some prognosticators, I guess that's the best way to call them, that say it's going to be the California primary and the New York primary that will determine who's going to be the Democratic presidential candidate.
Well, the state's moved up its primary to precisely for that reason, to make California more important, and so we may still, the state may still be determinative in who's going to win the Democratic presidential nomination. But I think you're right that the recall's been the only game in town all summer. It's dominated the national headlines, and come March, there's not going to be so much press on every little thing that happens in the recall.
But now here's a question that really hasn't been answered yet, and I don't know whether there is an answer. If the primary is held till March, could there be candidates that could be added to that slate? We now have, 134 people on that slate, or certainly people could pull out of the race by that time. Might we see even more candidates? You don't have the answer.
I think that we'll have to ask the Secretary of State for that one, but
I've been asking around. I haven't heard an answer on that one either.
I don't think there's a definitive answer on that, because the way the law reads is a certain number of days before the election you have to close the candidates list. Now, you've had an election date set, but if you move it, there's no precedent. This has never happened before, so they're going to have to make new precedent. Not only might you have new candidates adding on, old candidates who dropped off, Uberoth, Simon, they may hop back into it. You know, under the idea that, hey, Simon figures I got months to try and convince people I'm not a loser after all, and he's got a statewide base he can try to build on.
Well, that would be interesting.
Oh, boy.
Hadn't thought about that
for the
one.
Republicans.
Right. Yeah. Now, am I correct that the two of you agree that a postponed recall election doesn't necessarily have to work for Davis, that all the decisions that he's going to have to make in the meantime and public apathy might work against him? Is that what you're saying?
Well, public apathy would probably work for him if people don't show up. But if he does anything further to screw up, if there's a budget brouhaha, if there's other legislation controversial that comes up, there's always the chance he could reignite that anger. But if things stay the status quo the way they are now, it's probably going to slowly wind down.
Right. Gray Davis, if you look at the trajectory of his popularity over his career, it's gone nothing but down. So he's not going to just be able to say, well, with time, people will like me better. He's going to have to do something to show that he's this new, more approachable governor. And so he's been saying that during the recall, and if it's delayed until March, he'll have the chance to really show that. So he's going to have to take some action in order to let this this delay work for him.
Is that going to be tough for him to do, to become the more approachable governor? He certainly has been trying over the last few weeks, but he hasn't looked particularly comfortable as he's been out there in the hustings trying to get people to like him. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm wondering how long he can keep the smile up and all the touching and handshaking before he kind of runs out of the room screaming. So that will be difficult, because that's never been his style, per se, to be a touchy-feely Gray Davis.
Okay, now we know that a no vote on the recall is the only vote that will benefit Governor Davis. How would a March election affect the only prominent Democratic contender, and that's Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante?
Well, the longer this goes for Bustamante, the more he's basically tied to the yes on Davis, keep Davis in. If Davis survives the recall, Bustamante just goes back to being lieutenant governor. I think his campaign goes on hiatus for at least until just February or so leading up to the recall, because there's no reason to keep campaigning for him. The better thing is to allow the two Republicans that are still viable in the race to fight it out and slaughter each other. But Bustamante is basically tied directly to Davis now.
Yeah, but he's having some problems now, that he's having to defend the campaign contributions that have come in that were over $21,200 based on a loophole where he circumvented that limit. I mean, so he may have to do some repair work during these months. What do you think?
Sure, he's had some problems on the fundraising issue. He's also had some problems on the support for driver's license bill that allows undocumented workers to get driver's licenses. And if there's a March recall, that may be on the same ballot as a referendum that would overturn the law recently passed by the legislature. That could make that issue big, and I think that works against Bustamante.
That is most interesting. So you do or don't agree with Carl on the fact that he would have to go on hiatus until say February, or he might go on hiatus till February?
Well, I don't think he's going to go back to being the quiet lieutenant governor that he's been for 5 years. I think he's still going to be in campaign mode, but he does have a job to do in the state of California, and he's going to have to continue to do that. So I agree a bit with Carl on that.
Okay.
He's going to pull his campaign commercials. He's not going to keep going. But see, the Republicans, they can't do that. They're in an arms race now. If either Schwarzenegger or Tom McClintock ease off, the fear is the other guy will keep on going. So they're in a death march, basically an endurance race instead of a primary, to knock the Republicans down to one major candidate.
All right, so we do have, this sort of contentious race going on in the Republican Party. What impact could the increased scrutiny and the increased pressure of an extended campaign have on them? Because right now they've sort of been dealing with a short campaign. That's what their strategy is about.
Well, yeah, now you have to turn into a long-distance runner. That requires deeper pockets. It also is the problem on the Schwarzenegger side for more scrutiny, because eventually, as this goes on for months, Arnold's going to have to come out more clearly on his record. You know where McClintock is. He's on the conservative side on every issue. He's got that well nailed down. But Schwarzenegger is going to have that problem of having to define what he really means by health care, by worker compensation reform, how he will address the workers' comp versus what the state legislature just passed to try and patch things up, and that could trip him up.
Do you think? Go ahead.
Well, I agree that Arnold will have to take more substantive stands on policy, but I think the people who should really be popping the champagne bottles on this are Republican Party officials, because right now the Republican Party has this great dilemma where polls show that about 45% of voters support one of their top two candidates, while about 35% of voters support Cruz Bustamante. So they would lose an election if it were held today, but delaying an election until March gives the Republican Party a way to sort out where their support is going to go. Are the rock-ribbed conservatives who are now supporting Tom McClintock going to move to Arnold Schwarzenegger, or will people uncomfortable with Schwarzenegger move to Tom McClintock? The Republican Party, if it can sort that out, can win this election, but it may need more time to coordinate on which candidate their voters are going to favor. And
convince the candidate to either get out of the race or stay in the race. That's going to be part of it, isn't it?
Well, it doesn't look like Tom McClintock is going anywhere. He's having the time of his political life. He's getting to talk about very important issues. But the question will be, will some of the voters, if he tails down the poll, will some of his supporters switch to Schwarzenegger or vice versa?
Well, what is the possibility that Tom McClintock is going to get a word from higher up, the president or the vice president whispering in his ear, Tom, if you want to continue in the world of politics, drop out?
Well, so far the White House has tried to stay out of this race, partially because, as recent polls have shown, George Bush is not incredibly popular in California, but there have been some congressional leaders. There was a congressional leader who called Tom McClintock, and they had a big disagreement. Tom McClintock said, I convinced him that I should stay in this race, and the congressman said, no, you didn't. But there has been some national party calls coming to McClintock's campaign.
I can imagine that there would be. In terms of Arnold Schwarzenegger, will this give him a chance to become more familiar with the issues, to bone up on the specifics, and perhaps become more forthcoming?
Oh, he's going to have to. He's going to have to be able to, at some point, go into a room with Tom McClintock and head-to-head explain to the Republican base why it should be him instead of Tom McClintock. And given that you're going to have 5 months in between now, if this goes to March, oh, and then one other variation, the court didn't say it has to go to the March primary.
Up to March 2nd.
Yeah, so it could be, theoretically, even earlier than that. The court could issue a ruling saying at the earliest possible time you will have this. So that could add another whole level of confusion.
That would be an interesting New Year's Day, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes. But at some point, the two are going to run into each other. But I do agree, I don't think either of them are going to go anyplace. And you could have Bill Simon jumping back into it, or a Republican as yet undeclared who could show up into it. Because with the Republican Party, it's very fractured in California. There is no cohesion where the national party can push somebody around. Schwarzenegger's his own man. McClintock has his own political ambitions. And I don't see them really being able to take advantage of the next 5 months.
Okay, well, much of the public seems to believe that this whole postponement of the recall was politically motivated. I read somewhere a letter to the editor or something saying, well, Bill Clinton was in town to to campaign for Governor Davis, and a day later that 3-judge panel decided to postpone the election. So we sent KPBS reporter Karen Rostada out to interview some San Diegans on the street about which party stands to benefit from a delay in the vote. And let's take a look at some of those responses.
I think the Republicans will probably benefit because I think with the postponement, the Republicans are going to come back and have a lot more advertising and do a lot more things to say. You know, we need to be in office and persuade voters to come their way.
Maybe Schwarzenegger.
Why?
Because he needs some time. He needs a whole lot of time.
Neither. I really don't think so. It's not going to be a benefit to either. And I just think that, you know, it's kind of a travesty. So I really don't think it's going to be a benefit to either.
So you agree with that? I mean, you think that and neither party really benefits from the postponement?
Oh, no, I think the Democrats benefit from it. I think it's going to be better for the Davis campaign, all other things being equal, to help them retain it. And the Republicans, I don't think the Republicans know it would benefit them, because on the national level, there's argument that keeping a damaged Davis is better than putting in a popular Republican, because then you can't run against the damaged Democrats in the state. So the Republicans may be on a no-win situation here. On
the idea of this being a conspiracy, there are some right-wing talk show hosts that have been saying that the postponement is a left-wing conspiracy. It's a partisan move by the appellate court. Thad, have you been hearing any of this?
Well, I don't listen to too much Rush Limbaugh, but I have heard some of those charges. And look, I think it's clear from this conversation that it's hard to know who benefits from this case, and I think that the folks who brought the case, the ACLU, have sometimes sued the Democratic Party. They've brought cases on behalf of the Ku Klux Klan. They're not tied to any one party in an extraordinary manner, and so I think there are good, solid legal reasonings behind this case that, you know, it doesn't have to be a partisan.
Well, you remember in 2000 when the Supreme Court ruled in behalf of what many interpreted in behalf of President Bush, not then President, but the soon-to-be President Bush's candidacy. That was thought of to be a Republican conspiracy. So the conspiracy idea is out there without question. Meanwhile, when we take a look at what this recall vote might mean for Bustamante, let's say that Governor Davis wins in March, that it's no on the recall, maybe by a little over 50%. And let's say that Lieutenant Governor Bustamante wins in the candidate selection. I mean, even though he cannot become governor in 2003, do you expect that this is going to give him a big boost to run in 2006? Well,
I think Cruz Bustamante has already laid out his claim to the heir to the Davis administration, and as far as he's concerned, the next couple of years are the prelude to the Bustamante administration. So he will build on this, no doubt, no matter how this breaks out, to help him eventually try to be the Democratic nominee for governor. And as long as he's proven his loyalty, I think he had to make a choice over the weekend, the last week or two, and he had to choose between his own ambition to run against Davis or be loyal to the party and support Davis on the recall, and he threw his lot to the party. He had his own negatives that were building to a degree too, but I think that's going to stand him in good stead to become the Democratic nominee, the presumptive heir, in 2006.
However, if we look at the latest polls, it's true that Cruz Bustamante was ahead of all of the other candidates, and that Gray Davis's numbers were starting to mount, but they were still under the 50% mark. So doesn't that mean that Cruz Bustamante would be more likely to be our next governor if the election were held sooner rather than later? In other words, would he benefit, let's say, from an October 7th election rather than from a March election?
Yes, I think Cruz Bustamante's campaign strategy was built around this being a short election and this being an election where you didn't necessarily need to get over 50% of the votes to win. He moved to the left. Even though he had a tradition of being a Central Valley political moderate, he has become a populist in this campaign, trying to rally the troops and get out a solid 35 to 40% of mostly Democratic voters, that may not put him in good stead in the next gubernatorial election, where other Democrats, such as Attorney General Bill Lockyer, Democrats who don't have quite the name recognition that Bustamante's gotten recently, but have known fundraising capability and more moderate records, they may look like better Democratic candidates in the next election if Cruz doesn't get in here. I think his candidacy was built all around this being a short, crazy election.
I disagree with that, though, to the extent that in the primary it's about mobilizing your base, and that's why you always go left in the primary. So he's already positioned himself out there, and I think that'll work him well for the Democratic primary. I don't know about the general in 2006, but I think going into it, head over heels over Locklear or anybody else, he's got the name recognition in the machine, so he's in much better position come what may, unless his negatives go up big because of the Indian gaming and all the rest. If he only gets 10% of the vote coming March, then he's hurt himself. But if he can stay toward the top of the pack in March, then he's set up well for 2006.
But keep in mind that we might have different primary rules yet again in 2006. There's some rumbling that the open primary may be coming back, allowing independent voters into the Democratic primary, which could change that calculation, though I agree with you that under the current rules, that in the primary...
Can we just have two back-to-back elections that use the same rules?
This is California, after all. Do you think that President Bush really wants Arnold Schwarzenegger to win, or might an unpopular Democratic governor at the time that Governor Bush is electioneering in California for the 2004 election might give him a boost with California voters?
Oh, yeah, I think it splits both ways, which is why the White House has kind of kept its distance. Either way, a damaged Davis would probably do better for the administration. And in some ways, shifting this from October to March is helpful, because now you're taking a lot of Democratic money will have to be spent on the recall as opposed to being given to the Democrats for their own primary, and that'll leave the whoever comes out of the Democratic primary for president with less resources to draw on to take him into the fall campaign.
What about the money factor? We haven't really talked about that, Thad. I mean, a March recall election, that's going to require a great deal more money than has already been spent or been put aside for an October 7th recall.
Sure, I think it is, which I think helps the candidates who have their own financing.
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Arnold Schwarzenegger in this race.
But what happened to all the money that Gray Davis accumulated over the years? Can't he use that?
Well, he can use one of the really interesting things I think about the timing of this election is that Gray Davis had a fundraising advantage in a short election because he's not a candidate. He's actually running against the recall. He can raise money in unlimited sums. But the other candidates have to raise money in these chunks of $21,000, $200 at a time. So it's very hard to raise money in small chunks in a short period. But given a longer time to run, Cruz, Bustamante, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Tom McClellan are going to have a greater chance to get on equal footing with Gray Davis, who is able to raise millions immediately because he could raise it in unlimited amounts.
Which means that it would work against Gray Davis and for the other candidates.
Well, in theory, that's the case. Now, the question is how much of that money will the Republicans have to spend trying to knock each other out of the race? And that's one reason why if Bustamante were to remove himself from the process for a few months, it becomes like the debate where Schwarzenegger's chair was empty. After everybody bashed Schwarzenegger for 5 seconds, they turned on each other. So if it's just really the spotlight on McClintock and Schwarzenegger and Simon and whoever, they'll fight each other as a kind of public primary.
Carl, both sides, all sides have found one area of agreement that this California recall election is unique and that it's breaking new ground. Now, the question that I have, is it good for California?
All things considered, I don't think it's been good for the state. It's produced even more partisan divide. It's distracted attention from other issues that perhaps the legislature and the governor could do more work with. On the flip side, it's democracy. It's what's in the Constitution, and if the people want to do it, the people get what they want.
Well, I think that's the question. We just have a few seconds left, Thad. But is California reinventing the meaning or the practice of democracy?
California's been doing this since Proposition 13, which brought a firestorm of initiatives across the country. Whether other states will follow with the recall, I'm not sure, but other states have talked about it. They're talking about it in Nevada, doing recall of their governor, and certainly in a time when every state is having tough times and just about every state governor is unpopular, people are going to be looking to California and thinking maybe we should do this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Carl Luna.
Nice to see you.
Interesting discussion, as always, gentlemen. And that's all for tonight's Full Focus. For more information on this program, please visit our website. We also invite you to share your thoughts about Full Focus by sending us email or a letter. Excerpts from some messages will be read on the air. Please join us tomorrow night for a look at this week's San Diego Film Festival and a conversation with film director John DeBello about the 25th anniversary of his cult classic, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. For KPBS, I'm Gloria Penner. Good night.